Welcome to the Holiness Today podcast. On this episode, I have a conversation with General Secretary Gary Hartke. Dr. Hartke has served as General Secretary since March of 2019. Before this, he served for 18 and a half years as the Global Director of NYI. Listen as Dr. Hartke shares what he has learned in his over 20 years in global leadership, and in how the General Secretary's office resources and supports over 30,000 churches in 165 world areas. Dr. Hartke, it's wonderful to have you on the Holiness Today podcast. You have been supportive of the podcast from the very get-go, but you are a guest today, so this is a privilege. But to get us started, I thought it would be a funny question, kind of let our audience know, but what is a general secretary, or what does a day in the life of a general secretary look like?
Well, Nate, thanks for the invitation to join this podcast. Yes, I am a fan, and it's good to be part. So the general secretary is a position that is outlined in the manual. So it starts in Manual 325 and lists several duties there. And so it's very clear. If you look at the work of the General Secretary's office, you can trace all of it to what the manual prescribes. And a day in the life of a General Secretary, it was Phineas Bresee said, "The sun never sets on the Church of the Nazarene." And indeed, that is true today. Over 100 years later, we have things happening in the church all over the world every day that our office interacts with. And so my typical day involves, like many, email, some meetings, some phone calls, some time on Zoom, signing paperwork, contracts, working through some credential matters. Every day brings a variety of items.
And before you took the role as General Secretary, you had traveled to over 50 countries as the Global NYI Director, but that's probably exceeded that now because the General Secretary also travels. So a day in the life probably depends on, you could have said, what season, Nate? Is it during General Board? Is it during General Assembly? But you
Yeah.
also travel quite a bit in this role.
Yeah. So yes, when I was NYI Director, I started there in 2000 and finished in February of 2019, and traveled to 57 countries during that time, and many of those countries multiple times. And I travel less internationally in my role as General Secretary, more to our corporate meetings, which the majority of which are here in the United States. But now most of my time is in the office and working on the administration for the denomination.
And when you took the role in 2018, was it the next General Board was going to be in South Korea? Am I remembering this correctly? A COVID General Board, or did you get one under your belt right before that happened?
Yeah, so it was a bit of a unique transition in that, because I worked in the Global Ministry Center already. I was elected to the role in May of 2018, but I didn't start until March 1 of 2019. So I had 10 months to split my role between NYI and also shadowing Dr. David Wilson, who had been the General Secretary nearly 7 years by that time. And I had actually more than 7 years at that time. And I shadowed him. So I went through the February 2019 General Board shadowing him. And then March 1, I became General Secretary. And yes, you remember correctly, we had been planning to host the General Board in Seoul, South Korea in February of 2020. And just a month prior, the end of January, when the COVID pandemic began to emerge and there was some doubt, the event was canceled. The meeting was canceled, and we ended up bringing the General Board Executive Committee in. But within that 30 days or so of canceling the meeting and the time General Board would have been in South Korea, we realized it would not have been possible. I mean, the world changed so much during that time. But yes, my first official general board ended up being canceled.
And then your first official General Assembly got postponed. I guess it didn't get canceled, but postponed as well, right? Because that was going to be in 2021, I think. Wasn't that the date for that?
You are right. So in that same time, we were in the throes of planning for a June 2021 General Assembly. And we had heard all over the world, of course, the devastation of COVID, but the impact on travel. People were not receiving visa appointments. The passport delay had grown, and some flight costs began to skyrocket, and the need for social distancing was there. And so the very thought of spacing out thousands of Nazarenes in a meeting center, even if we could have met, the idea of potentially needing to social distance. How do you ride in elevators at a General Assembly and social distance and all of the elements? So yes, in that same first year, the decision was made by the Board of General Superintendents with the recommendation of the General Assembly Commission to postpone the General Assembly, and the General Board Executive Committee was involved in that. And indeed, we moved from 21 to 2023.
Do you think, had the COVID pandemic not happened, do you think you would travel more? Do you think we would Zoom less? Do you think that that kind of brought along or forced us to do more of these kind of Zoom meetings and change the way that we meet globally?
Yeah, I do think that the COVID changed our meeting behavior. We learned quickly that Zoom was helpful in many ways, and in other ways, we learned it was not helpful. It was helpful in cutting down expenses and connecting, but we learned that really it's best utilized when you've got a relational base with the people that you're connecting with. And we also learned the phrase Zoom fatigue. And if you were on a Zoom meeting more than 3 hours, it was very exhausting, and we were spending entire days going from a Zoom meeting to another Zoom meeting. And so I think it has a supplemental role in what we do. Face to face with a global church is preferable, but it's very expensive. The direction we chose at our very beginning of being a global church had a price tag to it, because we now operate in 165 world areas, over 500 districts and pioneer areas, and a lot of people that need to connect for various reasons. And so Zoom was good, but yes, COVID was a game changer, and I think it forced us into recognizing the significant role that Zoom would play. And so in my role as general secretary, a lot of the work I do is via Zoom. Part of that is I draw from my nearly 20 years experience connecting with people around the world, and and have gotten to know leaders who have become those I work with now, that I worked with back in the NYI days. But yes, COVID was a change in how we meet, how we plan for travel, understanding the risk of gathering people together. Definitely.
Yeah. And you mentioned that, but how do you think God has prepared you for this role as General Secretary, going back to your over 18 years of experience as the Global NYI Director? You had to oversee global meetings in that role, and kind of broke some ice a little bit with some satellite congresses too, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. But how did that kind of prepare you for the role that you're in today?
Yeah, I learned very quickly in my role as director of NYI how differently the world views meetings and approaches ministry, the various cultural richness that we have with our people throughout the world. And so I learned a lot about people's perception of time, and some It's very much driven by relationships, and the clock is secondary. Other cultures where the clock is the predominant choice. So when it's time to start, you start, and the relationships come second, and there's all in between. But I learned to lean into the wisdom of leaders around the world who bring in a whole different experience. And I think more than that, I learned myself that I could see, the longer I served, the particular viewpoint that I had, but I couldn't tell you was there. But it surfaced as I would be in another setting somewhere in the world, and I would realize that my view on something was vastly different than somebody else's. And it was because of the culture that I came from and what my experience was. So I learned to appreciate greatly, to lean in to the wisdom and value of leadership around the world and different ways of leading to get to the same place.
And one of the things I've noticed working in your department at the Global Ministry Center is the emphasis you have put on language services. I mean, language services did exist under David Wilson, but just a push to, at least with Holiness Today and other areas, to really be accommodating in different languages. But I'm sure you learned that in a very real way as a global NYI director as well, the importance of accommodating and making sure we're all on the same page of what we translate and what we're speaking and thinking. But share a little bit about the challenge of language as a general secretary, because I know that's a very impressive thing that almost happens seamlessly, but it takes a lot of work in preparation for that.
Yeah, that's a good question. It reminds me of many times in leadership seminars, someone will say to you, as a leader, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. You might as well just get started now. And which is great to say in a seminar, but a whole lot more painful to live out in life. And I remember in one of my first global meetings as NYI director, where we had leaders from several countries of the world coming together for a meeting. And I had not prepared any interpretation for the meeting. I had not translated resources for the meeting. And we got to this place, and I was almost giddy inside of all that was going to happen here in this incredible setting with all of these leaders. And then I had that painful reality of understanding that I did not prepare well. And it was a tough, tough meeting. And so I've had my share of experiences across time that have shown me the importance of translation interpretation, as well as my own travel, going to places and not being able to understand, traveling through airports and not being able to read signs, and just knowing what it feels like to be in a place where you don't understand. And if you think you understand, maybe you really don't. You get a partial. So every week in the Church of the Nazarene, being 165 world areas, we worship in at least 198 world languages, or 198 languages. That's what comes through our statistical reports. And so when you think about 198 languages and the various language needs, it merits a great effort on behalf of a denomination like the Church of the Nazarene that seeks excellence, that seeks to have people engaged at a high level and not create barriers or enable barriers, to remove those so that people can understand and participate fully. And so a lot of that comes out of my early painful days in NYI of realizing the need and then growing out of that. So I do have a heart for it, and I've been to many places where language was an issue. It did become a barrier, and how that limited the engagement of people who otherwise would have contributed so much more.
Yeah. So how many languages do you speak?
Well, so I began learning Spanish. My dream was to preach in Spanish one day. I think I'm up to a 3-minute sermon so far, but I have Spanish has been the language that I have concentrated on the most, and did much better when I was NYI director and traveling, but still practice it when I can. I am not fluent, but I am on the road to. I still intend one day to preach a
Preach a
sermon in
sermon.
Spanish.
Well, how many languages can you say hello in? Maybe that's a better way to think about
Oh my,
it.
uh,
Plenty, huh?
probably 5 or 6. Good number.
Yeah, yeah. You can just start. You can just pretend you know the other ones in
Right.
those meetings. Yeah, yeah. So, just a kind of a biographical question, but how did you get connected with the Church of the Nazarene? Did you grow up in the Church of the Nazarene, and then how did you feel God calling you into ministry, but maybe even specifically youth ministry?
Yeah, I did not grow up in the Church of the Nazarene. I began when I was 15 years of age, and out just outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, a little town called Pisgah, and was invited. Actually, my parents took me to the church, and the youth group members reached out. And over time, as I watched their lives and listened to their testimonies, recognized the void in my life. It was something they had, something that I wanted, and so that became a transformational moment in my life when I chose to follow Jesus there in that local church. I went to Mount Vernon Nazarene College at the time, and had planned to go into industrial engineering. So I took all of the base math classes, all of the science classes, anything that would qualify as a pre-engineering support area. And it was my first 2 years doing that, and consequently didn't do the other courses that a liberal arts college requires. So in my sophomore year of college, when I began to feel a call to ministry, and that call was being confirmed, I changed to become a Christian education major, and of course, then took all kinds of classes to meet that major, but also my required liberal arts courses. So my last 2 years were packed as full as I could get my schedule to get the classes that I needed. But that began a journey that resulted in 15 years of being a youth pastor and several other kinds of roles in the church along with that, and was able to lead several youth camps, be involved in youth ministry training, several other opportunities in the church.
And so you served as a youth pastor in Ohio right after Mount Vernon. Is that where you went to from Mount Vernon? Oh, you,
Yeah,
you stayed in Ohio.
I stayed in Ohio. The end of my senior year of college, I started at in Dayton, Ohio, at Beaver Creek Church of the Nazarene. I was there almost 3 years and moved to South Portland, Maine, and was there 4 years, and then moved to Chicago First Church, where I was there for 8 years, and then following that moved to Kansas City in 1998.
And then at Kansas, when you started in Kansas City, you worked in the global missions department. Is
I did. I met it was World Mission at the time, and Dr. Louis Bussell was the director. He was at Chicago First doing a faith promise, and we got acquainted at that uh, Sunday, a lunch after church. And it was sometime after that that I was contacted, and it was a vision of World Mission to connect World Mission to younger people. And so I bought in wholeheartedly to that vision and became the candidate coordinator, and moved to Kansas City in June of 1998. And my role was invested in working with people who had a call to missions, working with those who might hear a call to missions, and work through the development and training for them up to the deployment to the field.
at what point did you kind of feel the moving over into global youth department? How did that transition work out?
Yeah, so I was working in global missions and left work one day, and I was standing in the parking lot, and I had a phone call from a general superintendent. In those days, I don't believe the name registered. It was phone number, but I just answered it and learned it was Dr. John Knight, and he had called to ask me if I would serve, that I had been elected by the Board of General Superintendents to be the NYI director. And I was standing in the parking lot, just kind of in the middle of the parking lot, talking to him, and having given so much of my life to youth ministry. It was one of those moments where so many things came together. And even in my time in World Mission, those 2 years, 2.5 years, working with young leaders, young people, it was just one of those moments where it had all come together. And it's all I had known. I was working in youth ministry predominantly. And I quickly uh, felt like that was the direction God was leading me to go.
And so, what was the biggest challenge when you started in that role? I mean, you were there for almost 20 years, so you probably got to see a great development during that time. But what were some of the biggest challenges taking on that role? Probably felt a little overwhelming when you received that phone call, I would assume.
Yeah, it was. And I'd stayed pretty close to NYI during that time. And I
Yeah.
knew that as NYI grew, much of the office in Kansas City supported programs predominantly for the USA, Canada, what we now know as a region. Yet they had decided to globalize the ministry, but it had been a decision without any practical steps yet. So I knew the timing of my coming in, that they had made that decision. I had already learned in my time with World Mission and now Global Missions, the need around the world. I was able to see the church around the world in my role as candidate coordinator. And even my heart and passion for youth ministry grew in that time. So I came in with the understanding that this USA church, really with international interests, had desired and committed to become a global church. And so that was how my journey began, which led to that infamous one of the first meetings I told you, where it was a failure on my part to live into what it means to be global. We had done it for the USA church for so many years. That's just how we did it. And then realized there were going to be changes like that, but then a whole lot of other programmatic changes as well. And it began over the time. We developed a concept called a regional youth coordinator, which we have today. They serve in key roles really as conveners, as resource people, facilitators. We developed a field youth coordinator role. We developed training for district NYI presidents. And throughout that time, created models that work in the world today and saw youth ministry grow and develop and thrive around the world.
So then moving into your general secretary role, what do you think you identified or you felt maybe obviously every general secretary has to take care of the integral, General Assembly, General Board and make sure the administration works. But what did you feel personally as something that was maybe a challenge for you that you needed to contribute to in that role?
Yeah, I wish I would have known then what I know now. I just finished my 5th year in this role. And I think in this role, and what the manual defines as this role is very broad. And I think my desire was to go back from my experience in NYI, and that is to posture myself is there's a whole lot more I need to learn than what I can bring to the table. And so I need to ask questions. I need to ask powerful questions, good questions, get beyond curiosity in that, but ask meaningful questions that help identify the needs of the world. And so a few things have come out of that. You mentioned language services. Our manual now, even in the 5 years, I believe when I started, the manual had been translated into 14 languages. And I mentioned we worship in 198 languages weekly, that we needed to take a look at this. And then I learned that we had kind of a stratified strategy for translation, that the Articles of Faith had been translated in far more languages, but the complete manual and just a few. And I learned that there's no one answer to the church and the needs of the church. And it was a huge task, but working with groups, kind of look at what is our end goal? It's to help every district, all 500 plus of them around the world, to function in a healthy way. And so have support to the district superintendent and the district secretary as to the infrastructure of the district. And so really it was posturing myself as a learner and coming in and identifying what the needs were and then begin to work towards those. And one of them was obviously the growing need, which it is today. Even as I sit here today, if a new general secretary came in, she or he would say, translation is a big need. So I haven't resolved the issue. I just picked up the baton from where it was and have walked a few steps, but someone else would feel the same. So it's the ever-growing development of the church and the unique laws that exist in countries around the world, that even in our processes and structure, there's a lot to consider in terms of how the governments operate around the world.
Next general board is in South Africa. There's previously been one in the Netherlands, projecting into the future, but do you foresee there ever being a General Assembly international?
The general board will be in South Africa in February of 2025. We're excited about that. It will be the second time that the general board will be outside of the USA. The General Assembly, there's growing discussion on when, not if, but when will the General Assembly be somewhere else in the world. And of course, when we talk that, we look at capacity. We use very large convention centers, and we had a total just over 16,000 people that attended a portion of the General Assembly in 2023. It's a large gathering. We had over 3,000 delegates, 3,500 delegates at the 2023 General Assembly. When you look at the General Assembly, the NDI, NMI, NYI delegates. So just looking at delegates alone were several thousand. So, but the dream is that way, and we feel like that logistically there is a lot that goes into supporting a General Assembly. But as the world grows and the meeting spaces grow, that potential also grows. But housing and feeding thousands of people and having meeting space for plenary sessions, for workshops, for an exhibit hall, for food and beverage, it's all of that factors in. But there's a growing energy, I think, towards the day when that will happen.
Do you foresee technological advancement, figuring out ways to do remoting in to a General Assembly, more hybrid type General Assemblies and things like that?
Yeah, so you
Or
mentioned
general boards
right.
as well, yeah.
Yeah, in my time in NYI, we recognized in the Global NYI convention that we were not getting even half of our eligible delegates to attend. And much of that had to do with the cost, but more so the delegates being denied visas to travel into the USA. And so we began a model where delegates could meet in sites around the world, and our overall engagement increased some, but not as much as we thought it would. But it did involve delegates that could not have otherwise been involved. I think one of the great challenges for the General Assembly that we have not resolved, but we've not given a lot of energy to it either, is the complexity of a General Assembly. The number of resolutions that are considered, there were 124 considered last year. Those resolutions are dealt with or considered at a rapid pace with quite a bit of discussion. And even though we have microphones scattered throughout the room for the over 1,000 General Assembly delegates, some people leave a little frustrated that they never got to speak because we had exhausted our standing rules of how many people could speak. All of that becomes even greater when you have people around the world and who really can't see what's going on. They can't see maybe that others are at mics somewhere else. All they know is they're waiting to speak. And so I've learned in NYI some of the complexity, but I think our first approach to considering sites around the world is looking at the complexity of our business, that every delegate serves on a committee, one of 9 legislative committees. Each of those committees addresses or considers the resolutions assigned to it, and they're grouped, in similar themes. And then those resolutions come either adopted, rejected, or amended from those committees. Then they're discussed, and it's complex in the nature of the resolutions that come many times, but more so by the pace that we go, and just being able to follow along as a delegate can be a bit of a challenge. So I think that is an area we need to look at and see, okay, what is it about our legislative process that could be changed in order to accommodate more delegates. We have averaged since 2005, 82% of our eligible delegates have been in attendance. And we were very close to that. We had 1,042 delegates in last year, 2023, and there were just under 1,500 delegates eligible. And so we were a little lower this time, 2/3 of our delegates in attendance, but typically it's been at 82%. Whether COVID and the pandemic caused the lower percentage, we don't know, but we're certainly watching and listening to discover that. But indeed, if 2/3 of our eligible delegates are in attendance and 1/3 are not, it's something that's worth our attention and looking at to see if there's a better way.
In this past General Assembly, a lot of those delegates were first-time delegates. I think I heard something was over 50%. Was that the first time they had been a delegate at that General Assembly?
That's true. I believe it was right at 51%. And that
So
was
that
my
presents,
first.
well, I was just say that presents challenges in preparation of new delegates as well,
It does. What I
teaching
don't
them.
know is how that might vary from previous General Assemblies. It may be that every General Assembly is that
Yeah,
way. I think when we saw that, we kind of looked through the lens of the pandemic and
right.
all that would do, and probably that biased some of our reading of that. So it is true, over half were new, but it may be that over half are new every time.
Previously. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we don't have tracking on that, is what you're saying, that we don't know for sure on
We
those numbers.
would, but we haven't gone back and
Looked
looked at
into
it.
it. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the next General Assembly is in Kansas City. That's exciting. That's been made public. That'll be a little bit shorter travel for us, but Indiana's not too far away. But
Right.
where is that? I mean, what are the details you can give? Where's that going to be at in Kansas City?
Yeah. So the next General Assembly, the 31st General Assembly, will be June 25 through July 2 of 2027. It will be hosted in the Kansas City Convention Center and their surrounding properties in downtown Kansas City. Kansas City last was the host of General Assembly in 1980. At that time, the size of the General Assembly outgrew the capacity of the city, mostly with the need for lodging. But with recent developments, the Kansas City has built more hotels and have crossed over that threshold of what we need in terms of a base of hotel rooms, flights into the city, walkable city, lodging close to the meeting space, and so on, plenty of parking. So we are excited. Kansas City has been home for our headquarters now, Global Ministry Center, for over 100 years. It was the host of General Assembly for years, up until 1980. It's where we have a lot of our infrastructure, Global Ministry Center, the publishing house, our Nazarene Theological Seminary. There's a university here, Mid-America Nazarene University. There's a lot that is right here that people will have an opportunity to see and visit. So yeah, we're looking forward to it and are already making plans to host that General Assembly.
And and I'm gonna get the title wrong. You are, I think, still certified as a barbecue taste tester. What's the title for that? But
Yeah, I think this falls into a category of a moniker, but yeah, so I took classes to become a world barbecue judge, and actually classes makes it sound more than it was. It was a class, and everybody graduates, and then you become eligible to judge barbecue contests. So the largest barbecue contest in the world is here in Kansas City in our fall, September, October every year. And I have been a judge for that for many years now. But it's an opportunity to sample all kinds of meat from hundreds of people that come to Kansas City to barbecue and try to win the contest.
so you can provide information on where to get the best barbecue in Kansas City. What's your favorite barbecue spot in Kansas City?
Yeah, I think I would lean into Q39 for my favorite. It kind of depends on what you're in the mood for, and and then you choose. But Q39, Jack Stack, Oklahoma, what we used to call Oklahoma Joe's. Now it's just Joe's Barbecue. Three phenomenal, but then there are many more, and the people who have grown up in Kansas City have their own hole in the wall unknown barbecue place that is their go-to, and you try it and it's fantastic. So it's hard to go wrong here in Kansas City. I don't think business can survive with barbecue unless it's high level.
What would you say Kansas City barbecue does best as far as meat goes? What's your favorite item to order?
Well, the burnt ends here are, I think, one of the things people, if you're going to have one thing when you come in, get the burnt ends, and they come different ways, with sauce, without sauce. So you kind of want to think about what you like, and in the different restaurants prepare them and present them, and some dry, some with sauce, and all the different kinds to try. So even when you say something like that, there's quite a few varieties that you can taste.
Being in Kansas City and coming from Ohio, do you enjoy the food in Kansas City better than Ohio, or do you have places in Ohio that it's you got to go to when you're there?
Yeah, so when I'm back in Ohio, if I can, I like to visit Skyline Chili. Having been born and raised in Ohio, it was something I grew up with. And but I've discovered that when I'm back in Ohio and I take friends back with me, and I say to them, "Hey, I'm going to take you to this great restaurant." Uh, Usually people have a love-hate relationship with the chili restaurants there, and it may lean towards the hate side for some of them. Just the whole idea of putting chili on spaghetti, but when you grow up in that, it's difficult to eat spaghetti without chili and shredded cheese on top. They just go together.
So is that an Ohio thing, or is that mainly a Cincinnati area, or is that kind of the whole state of Ohio?
So Cincinnati had several chili restaurants like that, and now they're throughout Ohio. But I think Cincinnati, you didn't have to drive very far to find one.
So another piece of trivia, for our listeners is that you're a cyclist. When did you pick up your love for that? Is that something you developed? You've always been a fan of cycling, or is that something over time that you've developed?
Yeah, I have for about the last 20 years. enjoyed cycling. And I think this is a great lesson on discipleship, but it happened at church. Some of the guys at church that I became friends with, we would stand around and chat after a Sunday morning service. And it didn't take long for them to take the conversation to their bike ride the day before. And I listened to that for a couple of years and listened and listened and listened. And I thought, well, I travel a lot. That wouldn't work. We had children. That's not going to work. And finally, it was like, I can't stand this anymore. It's all you guys talk about is cycling. So one of the guys went with me, and I purchased a used bike and began riding, and been doing it for 20 years. And some of the same guys, most of us have been riding together for about 20 years.
Do you track how many miles you do in a year? Do you average differently or try and keep a certain amount, things like
I
that? Or
do, I do on good years, on years
yeah,
like this where I may not hit 1,000 miles. I don't, but on the really good years, I'll be sure to track them and let you know about
yeah,
it. But this
yeah.
is not one of those years.
Years that you're traveling or whatnot, you don't track it. So,
Right.
uh, in all of your travels around the world, what is the most? I'm trying to think about how to ask the question. You've told me stories before, but the most unexplainable thing that you've witnessed, strange occurrence, something that sticks with you, or maybe even just a funny story.
I remember one of the things that comes to my mind is going back to my early NYI days, that in those days, there was one NYI office. We didn't have the regional offices. And so in my role, planning the NYC was the responsibility of the NYI director. And I started in 2000, and there was to be an NYC in 2003. And so one of my earliest trips was to go down to the city, Houston, visit the hotels, introduce myself, go to the convention center, and get acquainted with the people so I would know who I was working with in the days ahead. And I remember going down and would go to these hotels and, make my way in, no big deal, meet the salesperson and so forth. And later in the day, after I'd visited 3, 4 hotels, I go to the main hotel, which didn't mean anything to me in those days, but the hotel where we had the most rooms. And there was some construction going on that said, just kind of had signs and, beware of the construction. Thanks for your patience for construction and all that. And so to avoid the main entrance, I walked in the side entrance of the hotel, and I went down the hallway, and I get to their grand atrium. It's a big property, the place where we were going to put most of our people. And there were all these hotel employees lined up with this red carpet out the door. And I walked through and said, excuse me, excuse me, excuse me, and make my way through up to the sales office on the second floor. And I walked in and introduced myself. And the salesperson, a bit bewildered, repeated that back to me, that you are so and so. And I said, yes. And she says, follow me, and went downstairs. And that whole reception was for me, and this whole red carpet. So here I come from the side, and they helped me save face. But, that was one of the things, if I knew then what I know now, I'd say always go through the front door. And no matter what experience you had, always go through the front
Front
door.
door.
And there had to be 30 people lined up on this red carpet. And they were prepared to do this grand, welcome. And instead, they were kind of awkward handshakes, and I blew
That's
it for
funny.
them.
No, just being humble. That's what it was. So here's some fun. I just wrote down some fun questions I could just ask you, rapid fire kind of questions. But do you have a favorite movie, and what is your favorite movie?
So I am not much of a movie watcher. I more follow sports, and so that one, I get distracted from movies pretty quick. It's hard for me to sit through and watch the whole thing. So I really don't have a favorite.
What about your favorite musical? I think I know the answer to this one, but
Yeah, so Les Miserables is one that I have been a big fan of, and it was one that I saw earlier on when I lived in Chicago and my introduction to musicals. But this whole storyline and the way it
Yeah.
ends, if you to love another person is to see the face of God, so just some of the storyline in it really moving for me. But Les Miserables.
Yeah. I don't know if he was as big a fan as you, but I'm pretty sure David Wilson was a big fan of Les Miserables too.
Ah,
So maybe that's part of being a general secretary. You got to be a fan of that. So did you grow in liking other musicals, or did you like musicals prior to that, or do you have other musicals you like?
I did not watch other musicals before that. Um, The Greatest Showman was another one that I'd say I haven't seen in person, but is one that I enjoy. Um, haven't gotten into others beyond that. I've seen Phantom of the Opera and some others, but probably a one-time experience for me.
Right. Yeah. So what sports then? You said you're more of a sports watcher.
Yeah, I love college football, watch a lot of that. I like uh, a lot of the college athletics, but uh, baseball, football, some basketball, but I can watch if there's a sport I don't know very well. I enjoy watching it. When the Little League World Series comes on, I like to watch that. Um, I like watching for the love of the game. And so I think that's why I like the younger groups, the younger teams, because you can see the love of the game there, and not that professional athletes don't have that, but
Right. You get to see it more.
yeah.
All right. So if you could travel to any point in time, when would you travel to and why?
Most recently I have been tracing my family line, and I could go spiritual on this, but I'm going to go personal on this, which I know is also spiritual. But I've discovered what I didn't know about my family and the Hartke line is that my somewhere along the line of a great 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 grandfather moved to Kentucky from Germany, and this being 150 years ago or so. And I would like to go back. I don't know a lot about my family line, and but I'd like to go back to uh, some of my earlier family life, and particularly Ferdinand Hartke was my great 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 one of the greats grandfather that I'm going to learn more about that immigration and move and just the livelihood. What was it like to move? Where did they live? Um,
Yeah. So
but
how have you traced how they came to the United States then at all and where they settled for a little bit, or still
I
kind of looking into it?
I am very high level. I got the basics, but
Yeah.
the the free versions you can find yourself here
Right.
and there online. I haven't gone to look at any city records or anything like that. But what I learned is what I thought was how my family got here was wrong. And
Yeah.
so now it intrigues me to go back and really be informed about it.
Yeah. What book have you read that you would recommend to others, or that was kind of a formative book in your life and ministry or education?
Yeah. Uh, wow. A lot of books that have been shaping for me. I think um, one of the books that keeps coming back to me, Stephen Covey, The Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, has been really helpful to me. And it speaks a lot about self-care and
Hmm.
about knowing yourself, having awareness, how you manage yourself and how you live well with others, how you continue to grow and develop as a person. But I have found the illustrations in that book I come back to many times and will reference, even if it's in my own mind. Okay, this is the principle of this, or you need to be spend more time on that. But I think in reading that book, it helped me understand where I'm at. It was kind of a grounding kind of a reading. to say, okay, this is where I am. These are some of the experiences that brought me to where I am. Where do I want to go from here? And particularly now when I have two grown children and two granddaughters, and I'm at the phase of life where I'm thinking not so much about myself, but how do I invest myself in my two granddaughters and generations that come behind. And a lot of that comes down to living well and living a life that someone could really see those principles at work, and something that I hope my granddaughters will say, I want that in my own life. And so that's one of the books that comes to my mind.
Yeah. If God told you, Gary, you have to switch career paths right now, money's no option that you'll be taken care of. What do you think you have? What passion or what call do you think you could have done besides what God called you to?
I, when I was in high school, loved the idea of the mechanical drawing. And I talked about what I thought would be the industrial engineering track. I took the engineering drawing, the architectural drawing, uh, the courses, all I could get in high school, and still have all my drafting tools. I don't think they work very well anymore, and they've gotten a lot better over time, but I still have them. Um, I don't know that I would do that. I'm an introvert, and so I
Yeah.
think a lot of that came out of my introversion.
Yeah.
But I kind of wonder. I was a recreation pastor in Chicago and loved working with families in the community with
Uh-huh.
recreation, providing great experiences for the families and their children. Uh, some days I think I'd like to be in community development like that,
Yeah.
uh, respond to what, I think we all know the needs around us and the news that comes at
Hmm.
us. And so I ask, okay, what are we going to do about that? And
Right.
how do we invest in our children to create a better future for them? And so my mind's drawn to that. Some days I kind of think maybe I want to be a chef and open a restaurant, or um, just the whole idea. I enjoy preparing food. I don't do it a lot anymore, but there's some days that I think, man, would that be fun? Uh, so depends on the day.
Yeah. Do you have a go-to meal that you like to prepare, or your show meal that when you have to do something real good, this is your go-to comfort? I got this one down kind of thing. For me,
Wow.
it's making pasta. That's my
Oh,
easy one to go to. Pasta sauce, and I've done it enough times that I can just do it real quick if I have to whip something up, But
well, I probably need some ideas from you. I don't have one particular thing. I'm a pretty simple guy. I can eat the same thing
yeah,
nearly every day, and some days I do, just for the ease of and so I found in this chapter of my life, I spend less time doing that, though I enjoy it. I spend less time. But I would say if I had to do something, it would be some items on the grill and grilling some chicken or
hmm,
beef or shish kebab, something
yeah.
like that.
So, do you have a favorite dessert?
When I go to a list of desserts, I if I see a strawberry rhubarb pie on there, and if it's warm with ice cream, it's a done deal. And though I'm probably more disappointed than I am uh, glad I got it, but I had that when I was a young child, grew up on rhubarb and
Uh-huh.
rhubarb pie, and when I see that, I've got to have it. But I I've come to acquaint myself with a lot of different desserts, and if it's fruit, chocolate, uh,
You'll take it.
good with
And
me.
that's my weakness. I like all sweets, so too many of them. Is
Yeah.
it Michael Thompson that hates rhubarb? Is that right? If I'm remembering that correctly, he's almost vehemently against rhubarb, if I remember correctly.
That's, I don't remember that, but he would be one of several that I know
Yeah,
that
yeah.
people will look at me around the table and say, of all these options, that's what you want.
We had it
And
in
hands down,
Michigan.
yeah.
So they made it a lot in Michigan growing up, but well,
Yeah.
Michael's from Michigan too, so he just
Right.
must have had it too much, and then he just refused it.
Yeah.
Well, in closing, Gary, what are your kind of what are you praying about? What can our listeners be praying with you about, and what are some of your hopes in the next few years for the Church of the Nazarene?
Yeah. I think coming out of the pandemic, there was a lot of disruption in our world, in individuals, in families, communities, churches. And we know whenever there's major disruption, there's major changes, or there can be major changes in lifestyle. And I think we're still coming out of that. And people who have made decisions that have taken them a different direction, and just a lot of change in our world in the last few years. And it feels like we're still coming out of that. And so for me, it's praying that the church can engage well in this season and recognize that people are coming out of a difficult time. And we think about, I've been reading stories lately of some of the graduates who, went through college online only. And, some of them are just now walking through a graduation ceremony that should have been 2 years ago, those kinds of stories. And when I stop and think about the impact of not growing up in a sense of community, and how has the church been impacted with community and being a body of believers, I pray that we would, as a church, respond to that. In my own local church, I've had a heart for a men's ministry and have been part of starting a men's ministry. And we've struggled a bit because those of us involved are busy and haven't really given it the effort it needed. But we started with a men's breakfast. And this last one we had 30 men there, which is the most we've ever had. Two guys that have been coming stepped up last month when our primary cook said he couldn't come. They said, we'll do it next time. And another gentleman, when we started the breakfast, we did a temporary start. We didn't have a regular cook or anything like that. But one of the men said, when I was growing up in my church, my dad prepared the men's breakfast at church and I helped him. He said, can I do this for the men? Because this brings me back to my dad and what I used to do. And so now he prepares our monthly breakfast. And I just believe that that's going to continue to develop, but I see it slow in coming, that the men need a lot of opportunity to connect and to be developed, and they may not reach for it themselves. And I think a lot of that has come out of the COVID and being isolated. And so I have a real burden for that. So I think my main prayer would be the unsettledness that pandemic created in a lot of us, the way it changed our perspective on life, disrupted our behavior. Things aren't the same as they used to be. So what does that mean now? I have a burden for that kind of deep-rooted community in our churches and how each one of us can contribute to being that kind of representation of Jesus in our church and body.
Well, thank you. Great to spend this time with you. It's been a joy to get to know you a little bit more.
Thank you, Nate.
Thank you for listening to the Holiness Today podcast. If you enjoyed this production and wish to hear more, visit holinesstoday.org/podcast or find us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts.